morning and welcome to this panel discussion, Can There Be Working Class Culture and Experience? My name is Jocelyn Li and I'll be your moderator this evening. I'd like to begin by thanking this evening's panelists for joining us. We have Walter Benn sitting next to me, and then we have Paul Elitzik, Jacob Denz, and Juan Conatz. I said that correctly. So they will be speaking in this order to this question in 8 to 10 minute sequences each, followed by a 3 to 4 minute response between the panelists, then a Q&A dialogue for the remainder of the discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists and read the description which you can find and follow in our pamphlet. So we have Walter Benn, who is a professor of English at UIC. His recent books include The Shape of the Signifier, The Trouble with Diversity, How We Learn to Love Identity and Ignore Inequality, a new book, The Beauty of a Social Problem, Photography, Autonomy, Economy. It is forthcoming in May from U.S. Chicago Press. He has been active in UIC-UF, the faculty union at UIC, and is a member of the editorial collective of nonsite.org. Second, we have Paul Elitzik, is the faculty advisor for FNewsMagazine, the award-winning student newspaper of the School of the Art Institute. He received the school's award for excellence in teaching and has taught courses in social movements, journalism, media, and literature. He was on the board of the defunct Illinois Book Publishers Association and was the publisher of Lake Eve Press, where he published books on left history, social science, and film. He was active in the student movement during the Vietnam War and later did workplace organizing before returning to the university, where he does less damage. Third, we have Jacob Denz, who is a fourth-year PhD candidate in the Department of German at New York University. His research concerns the relationship between law and feeling in philosophical and literary texts around 1800 with publications on the Eternal in Holderlin and Discourses of Servitude in Hegel and Nietzsche. He has been a GSOC activist since fall 2012 and was a part-time UAW staff organizer along with Natasha on the past year's contract campaign.
That part doesn't make any sense. That was a person that I thought might be here, but ended up not being here. So anyway.
Okay. All right, so there's a change in that. He ran unsuccessfully against the NYU AWD slate in last September's bargaining committee elections and maintains a blog, gsoccommentary.wordpress.com, critical of the caucus political orientation and bargaining and organizing strategy during the campaign. And last but not least, we have Juan Conatz, who is a warehouse worker and member of the Industrial Workers of the World in Minneapolis, where is the editor of The Organizer, the blog of the Twin Cities IWW. He also serves on the editorial collectives of Recomposition, a blog that features accounts of work life and livecom.org, a website which is one of the largest online libraries of libertarian, communist, and anarchist material. Juan's writing has appeared in the Industrial Worker newspaper, Shift magazine, and in the book Lines of Work, Stories of Jobs and Resistance. Okay, that's a lot of words. So now you're welcome to refer to your pamphlet as I outline what the panelists will be speaking on. So throughout the 20th century, there was a powerful idea that there could be a homogeneous experience which would culminate into a revolutionary working class culture. Whether represented through the USSR culture in the 1920s, the Mexican muralists and American Artists Union in the 1930s, or by the artists associated with the Art Workers Coalition in the 1960s to 70s, each movement sought to create artworks which would transcend the decadent forms characteristic of bourgeois culture. However, since the variety of revolutionary aspirations of all these groups ultimately failed to transform society in an emancipatory direction, the merits and potentiality of a coherent working class culture have been thrown into question. This panel seeks to explore the concept of working class culture, its history, and what it might mean today. Which these questions posed to the panelists include: first was bringing together a contingent of artists and formulating specific aesthetic sensibilities under the aegis of a working class culture, a necessary aspect of revolutionary organizing. Is it still necessary today? Second, can artistic and cultural forms be given to a wide swath of an international working class experience? Is it desirable to do so? And third, what does it mean to create a working class culture when an organized working class is at a historic low? How is class consciousness related cultural movements both in the past and today? So we'll have both.
Okay, thank you. So since my answer to the kind of question about the artist is basically no, I'm going to say something about that at the end. I gave you a little handout. The point of the handout is like half the argument of the talk. Just see what the issue is of discrimination, and you will see that at some point classism is there. And the reason I gave it to you is I wanted to start with one way that people talk about working class culture today, and that is in terms of working class cultural identity. I'm going to quote from a recent writer on the topic who says to us that it's important for us to recognize that, after all, everybody has an identity, and that working class is at least, although not only an identity. As he says, classism is a real phenomenon, and it manifests itself even among those who are committed to class struggle in a more structural sense. That's actually Peter Frey's from Jacobin. That's why we had to feed the Jacobin that we were talking about. I could read more, but I only got 10 minutes. I just want to say the first thing to say about this. The whole point of the identity model that Frey's is defending here is its commitment to the idea that identities are fundamentally equal, and that therefore the difference between them should be respected. Whereas the crucial, and when we look at ableism, classism, racism, caste, ageism, sexism, sexualism, sizeism, and cissexism, and down at the bottom are invited to check our privilege, the whole point of that is to recognize that there's a correct attitude toward being taken to these different identities, and that correct attitude is precisely one which ignores, or rather rejects our privilege, and is one of respect. So I want to say what all those things have in common with the important exception of class, where the fun is that they demand that differences between identities be respected. Whereas the crucial difference between capital and labor, the fact that one is exploited by the other, is not obviously a difference that labor wants respected. So while it's certainly true that contempt for others should be expressed only rarely, we should never say never, worrying about class privilege is at best itself an expression of class privilege, and is more fundamentally an expression of the desire to redescribe the relation between the classes on the model of recognition. Back in the day, it was just called, noblesse oblige, but no one ever thought that the point of noblesse oblige was to get rid of the noblesse. On the contrary, it's a way of form of etiquette for noblesse, right? And although we shouldn't think of class as an identity, we should certainly acknowledge, to recur to the terms of our discussion, not only that there can be a working class experience, but that there in fact is a working class experience. And it's fundamentally the experience of being paid less than the value of what you produce. And of course, our long-term goal is that no one should ever have that experience. The core of working class culture, then, needs to involve understanding what it means to be exploited labor, which in fact many workers already understand quite well. It most emphatically does not involve celebrating the working class or producing art that is committed to celebrating the working class. That's actually what non-working class culture is for. It's true that the bosses are not always as appreciative of workers as they should be. That's the classism problem. But the better they understand what labor in our currently unorganized form does for them, i.e. produce profits, the happier they are not only to sing its praises, but to identify themselves with it. That's why the emblem of, say, the political significance of hip-hop. So, I knew with Adolf being 4, so Adolf's got to be the only person in the whole world. I actually would thought, there's the old argument that exists of God, that which nothing can be greater, includes existence, so therefore there must be God. So I would have thought, though, that, leaving the God part out, that I was the exemplary instance of someone than whom there could be no one opposed to cultural politics. But Adolf proves that wrong. But this is hip-hop is just like, for me, a marginal example. For you, for reasons that are too complicated to explore, it's more central. That's why the emblem, though, is, say, the political significance of hip-hop would not be some rich old white guy fulminating against it, which would be an example of classism and racism, but some slightly hipper rich old white guy singing, like, I got 99 problems, but a union ain't one. So it'd be like, which is actually what that song means, even if it is using a slightly different word. And that's why I returned, for those of you who were last night, to what I was saying yesterday, organized labor, that is what would be the problem. Unorganized labor is not the problem for our guy. Organized labor needs to be at the heart of what we would call a working class culture. But of course, at this point, it's hardly barely accurate, not really accurate at all, I think, to call that a culture. What it actually is something that was actually talked a lot about in the panel before, and I think very, very usefully, political education. And the one thing I would say about that, before I get to my one example of political education, would be so that, so now the person who got the names crossed, the question is permanently crossed in my mind. But the guy from the CTU, Brandon. So Brandon had a lot of things to say, and I too think the CTU is the model for the left today, and we should all figure out how to help the CTU, how to, in a little tiny bit of way, make the CTU better, although they may need to make us better, and how to support it in any way possible. And I agree with like 99% of what Brandon said, not the 1%. And this, he was talking a bit about his father saying to him, you can be whatever you want. And about how that then produced kind of tensions within not just families, but larger groups. Of like, well, I can be whatever they want, but those guys aren't even trying. They are trying to be whatever they want. And then just reminded from that, of course, that's at the kind of core. He had associated this earlier with the idea of sort of a left commitment in the public schools. But, insofar as education, the beginning of our education is to tell people that the importance of schools, that it gives them the opportunity to be anything they want. That we've actually just begun with the biggest possible propagandistic lie there is. Every form of American education should begin by telling people, actually, not that you can do anything you want to, but that you can hardly do anything at all. And that, it seems to me, fundamental to the sense of what it would mean not to begin to explore working class culture, but begin to think about what political education for members of the working class should be, and has to be in order for it to be actually not just a celebration, which serves the bosses, but a kind of recognition of reality, which is the only possible basis for organizing. I mean, there's no point in being proud of being working class when the whole point of being working class is to exploited labor. The point is to recognize what it means to be exploited labor and to begin to think of ways that we can stop being exploited labor. So, the kind of core commitment here is going to be that what working class education should be, what political education should be, is about our impotence. Now, what that means is not respecting people's self-descriptions, much less celebrating their self-descriptions, but refusing to respect them, trying to get them instead to understand themselves very, very differently. So I was involved in organizing professors. There is no group of people who it is harder to get to understand themselves very, very differently, i.e. correctly, than professors. And I will stop right there. That's all right, we'll come back to it. They don't need to hear about professors. A lot of them are students, they know how to do it. Here, we'll come back to it.
I'm going to show some slides because it's the only way I can stay on message. And I'm not going to respond to some of the questions directly because I don't agree with some of the premises. I think that the first couple of slides are going to show that, but then what I want to just focus on is I just want to show you some things that which I won't try to put myself on the level of some of the people here. I'll just describe a few examples of artwork that I think exemplifies good ways that artists can engage with not just the working class, but with much broader audience. So. First, I'm sort of an academic, but not entirely, and well, I'm sorry, I should just skip on to that, but I will say that you can expect, how many people here from the School of the Art Institute? Good, well, I'm going to show some work by alumni that you should know about if you don't already. So, about working class culture, she is a good example of someone who, a working class woman who was one of the great working class examples of creator of working class culture. And I think that if you think about her, you realize that working class culture is not just distinctively for the working class. I mean, she had a very broad audience. And she was expressing a lot of things besides her exploitation as a performer. Race, gender identity would also, sometimes be a lot more the subject of her songs. And I think the working class, whatever it is diverse in identities, values, and attitudes, and I think will be even in revolutionary situations. And of course, it's the task of the activists in the working class on the side to try to construct unity that can lead to transformational change. Here's another example, and this is kind of interesting to me because we're in 112 South Michigan, and this is a novel written by one of the security guards who works in the lobby. And she is a working class woman, and This is her first novel, and it's a new form, really, in a way. The novel's an old form, but when you publish it on the web, and you do it with another, like where the publisher is another working class woman who just figured out how to do e-book publishing, and there's a whole circle of, there's a whole little network of women writers who have gathered around that particular publisher, and it's a friendship network as well as a network of people who are trying to be writers. And so I don't know, I mean, if you want to think about working class culture, there's a tendency to just talk about what it might be one day, but I think that if you're going to engage with the working class, you want to recognize what it is today. And you should pick up the latest issue of FNewsMagazine because there's an interview with her in it. Just published it. She just published the book. And you can get that on your way out, or I have a few copies here for anyone who's interested. So I like that it's, it shows that it doesn't take, there isn't a very high entry fee to publish an ebook. Like I was a book publisher for 30 years, and I know something about what the economics was, but I got out of it before people started doing ebooks. And there's this DIY. Kind of idea that people have, that they can't do everything, but they can do ebooks if they can write and if they have some computer skills. I like the idea that it's non-professionally trained cultural activity, and here is another example of an SAIC alum. Does anyone know Wafa Bilal's work? He is one of our alumni, MFA in photography some years ago. Now he's an NYU professor. And he's done, this was the first thing that he did that engaged with a very, very wide audience. This was after his brother was killed in Iraq in a bombing raid. And he decided to do this 30-day performance inside of the Flat File Gallery in Chicago, where he set up a paint gun that was remotely controlled, and people on the internet anywhere in the world could shoot him, and other people could decide to block them from shooting him. And it was a very, very stressful type of situation. The idea, of course, was people in Colorado can be sending cruise missiles without any idea of the pain that they're causing. So anyway, the website had 80 million hits, 65,000 viewers from 136 countries, and 60,000 shots were fired. Now, there's another alum that I'm going to talk about who became even more celebrated recently, Paul Chan. Chan was, how many people know who he is? He just got the Hugo Boss Guggenheim Award, $100,000. And now you can write him a card congratulating him, saying, now that you discovered oil in your backyard, I want to be your friend. And he now has an exhibition in the Guggenheim. And he, I think it was in 2002 and 2003, in that winter, he went to Baghdad on an Iraq peace team with Kathy Kelly of Voices in the Wilderness. And he did this kind of documentary, Baghdad in No Particular Order, which just shows, it's not propagandistic, which makes it really good propaganda in my view. It shows people of Baghdad just living their ordinary human lives. And when he got back, he posted portraits of a lot of the people on his website with the suggestion that anti-war activists could print those posters out and repaste them around New York so people would see who it was who was going to be dying in the bombing. And the next thing he did, this is really movement culture, but the 2004 Republican National Convention, he and the Friends of William Blake, a group of artists, did a kind of a parody of those old street maps and road maps that folded out and were really hard to fold in again, that nobody uses because of Google Map and that stuff. But it was it showed you when and where the Republican delegates to the convention were likely to be, in case you had something to share with them, and where to find toilets, how to get legal support, and it's kind of cute. Everybody who got it kind of loved it. But a better example of what the possibilities are when he put on, this is his most well-known activist art. He put on a production of Waiting for Godot in the streets of the Ninth Ward in New Orleans, together with the classical theater of Harlem. And the way he did it, I think, is people can learn a lot from. He didn't just do the production, go in there and leave, and maybe build for an audience with usual publicity techniques. He went to New Orleans months before, and he started talking to and meeting with community organizations and with their neighborhood contacts, and going to schools, talking about the project, and he even taught 2 courses without pay at a couple of universities. And then they did Waiting for Godot out in the street at night, and everybody who came would get a gumbo dinner and hear some music before the performance began. Overflow crowds, thousands of people came. And he also did some fundraising. Obviously there was a lot of money that had already been put together to pay for the production. So what he did was fundraising to match dollar for dollar what the production was costing, and that money was going to go to community organizations in New Orleans who were doing hurricane relief. So this idea of, if you go into a community to do art from the outside, at least give something back and think about how to do that. This is,
I'm going to
yeah.
need to wrap up in 2 minutes.
Okay, well, hipsters out of Pilsen, SAIC UIC, Eric Garcia's murals. Eric Garcia is a great Pilsen artist who is an SAIC alum in painting, MFA in painting, and he does these projects in the schools. Every year this is in Corkery Elementary School, and he also does great cartoons, which are, they're published in a few different places. And I just want to close with this. This is another idea of people's culture, and includes working class culture. There's a lot of working class people doing it. But the response of people in Catalonia and Barcelona to the crisis is the development of the flourishing of cooperatives of all kinds that bypass the capitalist economy and an awful lot of exchange. This was a project that Manuel Castells, the sociologist, was involved in. He's Catalan and spends half his time there. And did a big social survey to understand how this was done. And if anyone is interested, go on the web. I mean, it's amazing all of the different kinds of alternative cultural practices and economic practices that the people there are doing. I mean, everything from doing some people approaching a farmer and saying, "You're not using this land, let me farm it, and I'll give you some of the crop." All kinds of exchanges of skills for goods and goods for goods and skills for skills, and free university, free childcare, a lot of things like that. Since people didn't have the money. And so, if you want to look at it, there's a documentary that is really cool on the web. Do a search for Homage to Catalonia 2. Okay, so I will save my generalizations for discussion.
Thank you very much. So I won't be talking about the working class as a whole, but I'll instead be discussing how the term culture in particular has played out in some of the internal debates within my own union of academic workers, in my case, graduate students, graduate employees. And I have to confess to real skepticism regarding this term as it's been used in that context. Self-proclaimed reformers in my union have indeed asserted that it's necessary to create a vibrant union culture, not just a culture, but a vibrant union culture, and even argued that this is actually a prerequisite to militantly confronting our management. So in other words, it's not that the culture is going to emerge from the confrontation with management, but rather you have to create the culture first, and then you can go ahead and you're going to be strong enough with that culture to then confront management, which I disagree with very strongly. First, I should just say, I think if we have to do that, I don't see a lot of hope for us. I mean, we're academics. Just to echo something Professor Ben Michael said, I mean, we sort of, are very intellectually competitive with each other. I think we don't always particularly like each other. And although I am wearing vibrant, brightly colored pants today, so that's I guess, on the vibrant side. But what I find interesting about the way that reformers have used the term culture is the tension between its suggestion, on the one hand, of somehow being organic, spontaneous, natural, that's what a culture is supposed to be, right? And on the other hand, the imperative, which was the only sentence they ever really said, we must create a culture, right? Okay, so I also just have to say, I think that there's something neoliberal about the idea that you can just create an institutional culture and that's going to be what like motivates people to participate in that institution, is that culture that you've created. Maybe we can talk about that in the discussion. But in any case, I think that this is a clear instance of where attempting to focus more energy on creating a culture actually led to a much less militant campaign, or at least unnecessary delays in taking militant actions, because the idea was that we weren't going to take the strike vote until we already had this this vibrant culture. So there are a couple reasons for the drop-off, I guess, in militancy that had something to do with the culture. One is that, increased emphasis on like physically attending union meetings, so that we could have a shared union culture and a shared like physical and discursive space, which I think is very important, and I don't at all think unions can do without that, but I also just really want to emphasize very, very strongly that that's a great thing, but it's a tiny, tiny, tiny number of people who have ever participated in that space. I think that the most well-attended meeting of our membership had maybe 1% of people who could plausibly be said to be union members, and so that's really the most important point that I think that's, if you take anything from my presentation, I think that's what you should take. Furthermore, groups that had the most at stake economically in the contract were also the ones structurally, of course, who are least likely to be able to attend the union meetings themselves. So people with families, in our case, international student workers who didn't have other options for working in the United States, the lowest paid workers in the union, people with health problems. So the project of creating a shared union culture, even if you're a little more sympathetic to it than I was in our case, was still doomed from the start to some degree of like insularity and esotericism, frankly. Now, what there are in our union are somewhat more robust union cultures in individual departments. It's interesting, the internal politics of our union fall very much along department lines. So on the reform side, there's like sociology, anthropology, history. The language, the literature departments are a little bit split, but tend to be more supportive of a sort of like majoritarian organizing strategy, like my department, German, comparative literature, and so on. Also the sciences and engineering tend to be more on that side of things. But it has a lot to do with who likes to go to union meetings themselves. Also, most people don't like to do that, as it happens. I actually do. So that's why my big union project right now is pushing a member petition to district our union's elected steward positions by department proportionally to the number of workers. So I think that's both the most democratic arrangement because it's the most likely to lead to, leadership from outside kind of the usual range of suspects, but also just the most effective in like enforcing the contract, which I think has to be our priority. It maximizes the probability that there's going to be some elected leader who knows, whether the contract's being enforced in a specific department, and also, understands those working conditions. So I guess in the terms of this panel, I would phrase my argument by saying that we should acknowledge the culture that already exists in the university instead of just trying to create our own out of whole cloth. For example, by having lots of rallies, which we did do, and I think some people thought that they created something of a culture, but I don't think anybody thought that they created a culture that actually supplanted like the overwhelming culture that already existed in the university. And I think there are differences of opinion about how important it is to do that. And then so on the other hand, I kind of alluded to this already, the emphasis on culture contributed to a bit of sort of devaluing, or at least using as a last resort, like organizing and majoritarian tactics in general. So there was, after the Reform Caucus won the elections, and it took 2 months for us to really embark on any sort of majoritarian organizing, and we were waiting and trying to see whether our culture worked out. Maybe some people thought it did, maybe some people thought it didn't. It's certain that our events, made no impact on management at all. Or at least, well, maybe it's not certain. I would argue that they did not. Members who don't engage in 10 meetings but do engage in conversations with their colleagues and even organize have unfortunately been dismissed as apolitical or as engaging in only passive participation, and that's a real problem. Even if you think that you wish that our membership was all a certain way, like we don't get to pick that. Like this is the membership that we've got. And I guess I want to say too, and maybe I'll close with this. There's been, unfortunately, both like the UAW and the union reformers have tended to suggest that, for different reasons, have tended to like obscure the importance of paid staff organizing positions and actually like organizing this union at every stage. So whether it was recognition, our contract campaign. Of course, the UAW wants to say this is a grassroots movement. This is graduate students, and in a lot of ways that's true. And I was one of the paid staff organizers. I mean, it was we came from the membership partly, but it's also just. And then on the other hand, the reformers wanted to say we did this ourselves. We did this actually against the wishes of the UAW bureaucrats that were holding us down, and so on and so forth. But that's just not true. Our campaign wouldn't be anywhere without the millions of dollars of resources invested in organizing salaries, and that we don't get anywhere by not acknowledging that. So I think I'll close with that. I mean, my overall argument has just been that this term culture, even in contexts where you might not expect it, can function ideologically to obscure whether you're actually taking militant action to confront your management or not.
Thank you. And we have Juan.
So I don't know a lot about the specific art movements that are mentioned in the panel description, but being on the left, I'm familiar with the concept. The stuff I'm more familiar with is sort of like the old left, like propaganda, like elevating the noble existence of the work being done or the worker itself. I'm not sure if that was ever a good idea to create that type of culture and elevating the work and the worker. I definitely don't think it's a good idea now. I don't think that there's anything noble about being working class. It's a category that, along with all classes, should be got rid of, should be abolished. So I'm not as interested in encouraging identification with work as much as identifying shared grievances that we have at work. And I think also some of the old stuff, the old conceptions of worker identity, I think they might have been tied up with an outlook that thought maybe most work post-capitalism would be more or less the same, except maybe more democratic or maybe more beneficial to the wider society. But I think most people now know that that isn't necessarily enough. I mean, there's the whole issue of the environment. There's so many jobs that are just absolutely destructive. There are a lot of industries that just wouldn't exist without, capitalism. As an example, I worked in a warehouse once for a couple years, and the whole point of this warehouse was to make, if you've ever been to Walmart, those displays right in the middle when you're walking down the aisle, that's all they made. And, hundreds of people working there, all this millions and millions of dollars of resources and raw material going into that. That's not something that would really exist without capitalism. Fast food's another example. I think our imagination has to go further than a more democracy at Starbucks or so yeah, and then there's a lot of other industries too that are like that are just so fundamentally intertwined with how capitalism is that why would we elevate that work? We have to aim to get rid of that type of work and make more meaningful. I don't want to use the word more meaningful work, but make things that people can do that are more meaningful. Despite this, I think we should still encourage working people to talk about work and be represented in art and the propaganda that we put out, but with an eye more towards the reality rather than its supposed virtues. That's all I have.
Well, before we begin our response to this, I'd like the audience in the room to begin formulating potential questions as succinctly as possible. Our Q&A will follow afterwards. So I don't know if the panelists, we have about 15 minutes or so for a dialogue, or possibly a little bit more. So does any of the panelists have questions for each other or comments that you would like to make in response? Well, I can probably pitch something to you. I've been noticing sort of a trend among the four sort of speeches in which there's hasn't been really a point to make about what is the working class identity. Now, I do know that you had mentioned that it is multifaceted and so complex that it's so hard to pinpoint. Yes, Walter. And then,
Tell me about this.
no, actually, you mentioned more about identity models, and how there's this reduction of privilege as well, and so that's one facet I'm going to be mentioning. And then the other part was the union representing the working class, and it sort of is interesting because who is it that is not represented may actually then be defined as working class. Or is it possible that just because you don't have a union, you're not working class? So there's this complex way of looking at what is working class culture is surrounded by identity politics, and then there is a skepticism of who is represented under unions, and then also within art, sort of this cultural relevance of, or I should say, where is the cultural relevance to the working class culture in art? And then finally, we have this romanticization of the working class, and one's hope that our imagination can go beyond democracy. So it seems like there's no common ground other than the exploitation of labor. And maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, so I will say something quick about that. I mean, two things. First, the art question. You did engage with that. It's great to know that the contribution that the students at the Art Institute are making to the left and the work is really interesting. But I would say I don't think there really is any contribution about art. I think it's important to be super elitist in art and not to be at all elitist in politics. I think that those two things have a very complicated relation to each other, which is not really our topic today. But it is the topic of my new book. Probably don't buy that. It's not that expensive, given that they're very beautiful reproductions of it. So I wanted to say something about art. But I think the thing about working class culture is important in this respect. I thought that Juan said it perfectly, that we don't want to get together about our shared identity. We want to get together about shared grievances. Shared grievances are really, really important. And I don't mean just like, they docked me because I was late 5 minutes late. That is a real grievance. But that is, structurally, we all have shared grievances. The difficulty of organizing professors, especially tenure-track professors with non-tenure-track professors, is it's hard to get them to see that they have shared grievances, but it turns out not impossible. So you want to say, and that's what's wrong with culturalist notions of the working class. So like, the working class is represented on my campus by everybody, basically, but importantly, let's say, by guys who are cleaning our floors, who are paid like $22,000 or $23,000 a year, by the guys who are teaching our first-year writing classes, who until recently were paid about $25,000 or $26,000 a year. They are very different in one sense. One group is not only well-educated, but they all have PhDs. The other group is not well-educated, don't have PhDs, and they're separated by $5,000. Our unionization efforts actually produced a pay increase for some of those guys, the guys who are teaching first-year writing. Our support for the others will hopefully produce a pay increase for them as well. But the crucial thing that's important for us is that if you're going to organize people as workers, you have to get them to see their workers, and we had to get our NTT faculty to see that they are workers in the same way that our custodial staff is. That's hard. Nowhere near as hard as getting the fucking tenure-track faculty to see that they are actually just slightly more privileged workers, but in the same spectrum as the other two. Actually, that also turns out to be possible. When we started organizing, I just want to echo, what Kate said about without the UAW, no union. Without the IFT, and the AAUP in some degree, but above all the IFT, we would have no union either. We, however, have not been quite as forgetful of that as you have. You want to give up NYU, it's fucked anyway, come to UIC, we'll see if we can work on something. And I would say that the crucial thing for us really is to get to see what working class culture should be. It is not some collection of propagandistic art. It is not some set of songs or some kind of TV shows. It is whatever it takes to get people to understand, A, that they are workers, and B, what it means to be a worker in capitalist society. And professors are stupid, but it turns out not as stupid as you would have thought. That is, our professorial staff did, in the end, come to understand what it meant to be an exploited worker in a capitalist society, and joined with our NTT faculty and with everybody else in forming our union. To me, that doesn't make it a large union by any means. There's a lot more work to be done. But that seems to be the contribution of the idea that when we're organizing, the organizing must be class organizing. But that's a capacious concept in our society, because there's many years in which people thought, especially in the 50s and 60s, the notion of class was too reductive to explain the structure of a modern capitalist society. But actually, that's totally false. The notion of class is very clarifying in explaining the structure of our society. It's very clarifying in saying there are some guys who make $150,000. They're way better off than the guys who are making $25,000. But they have certain crucial things in common. And when you can begin to get them to see what they have in common, that is, that they actually do still belong to the working class, that makes a fundamental difference in their sense of what it means to be working class, and then the possibility for the
Did you have anything to say?
I would just add, class consciousness among graduate students I think is difficult in an ultimately very similar way. It manifests itself a little bit differently. one thing was the idea that our most important allies were undergraduate students and especially superstar sort of tenured faculty, which certainly individuals among those constituencies supported us very importantly, and strategically it was very important to have as much support from those constituencies as possible. But it did suggest that there was not necessarily the level of recognition or of thinking of ourselves as workers as there could have been. And actually there were comments, for example, to the effect that, we should try to, this was not saying that we shouldn't be in solidarity with the adjunct union, but they were we should avoid having our pay tied to the adjunct pay, which I actually, that may have been the best thing for our union. The idea was they must be a much weaker union because they are not socially cohesive. That was the phrase that would use. So in other words, the fact that we share a department, we go to the panels, all this kind of stuff, that's what makes us a strong union. There's just no evidence that that's the case.
those guys should be shot. I was going to say, it'd be totally clarifying.
While you were writing some notes, I wasn't sure.
Yeah, they should be shot. I thought you said elitist in art, but not politics.
Yeah, you're right, it's coming out.
So,
elitist in art, Stalinist in politics.
Okay. Well, I actually wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about what you meant by elitist in art, or how that applies to what you think of as working class culture, or as left culture.
Yeah, I don't know that I can successfully do that. I think that a crucial thing would be, in our period, to disconnect the notion of art from culture, and to think about how that works, to think about the history of modernism, to think about the history of art, which would be maybe completely of interest to a few art institute students here, but maybe not to anybody else at all. But it would be to think about what modernism meant for our understanding of art. And I think that the left makes a big mistake, but not bigger than the right mistake, in thinking that if we identify art with the expression of a culture, if we identify art with the expression of an identity, if we identify art with a kind of appeal to a certain sort of social work, a certain kind of NGO model of doing good in the community, that actually counts as left politics in some way. So I wanted to say about Paul Chan's production of Waiting for Godot, right? Which I did not see, but which I had seen. The whole question of what the politics of that thing was would totally hinge not on the idea of it, but on the idea of the production of Waiting for Godot. That is, whatever you do in the community, whether you do it in the streets or whether you give the money back to anybody else, all that's NGO stuff. The question of what it means as art is the question of what did that director think Waiting for Godot was all about? What was that performance of Waiting for Godot all about? What was the kind of the aesthetic ambition that is the constructing idea of that performance of Waiting for Godot? So I can't say anything about that because I didn't see it. I have zero clue. But what I would say, and again I realize this is not an explanation, it's just a kind of attempt to point out where I think the issues will begin to arise. Aesthetic questions are aesthetic questions. They're not unrelated to politics, but they're not simply translatable into politics. So the question of what it means to make a great work of art is an important question for every single artist. The question of the relation between what a great work of art is and left politics is an important question for us. It may or may not be an important question for those artists. And I just think it's kind of crucial as a way of thinking about what art is. You can't understand art and you can't understand politics if you think that one will simply function as the expression of the other. So again, that's really kind of out of it. I get that that's not an explanation, but we do seminars on that. You guys in the audience do, actually, I believe, can take our seminars for free. Look forward to seeing you next fall.
I'd like to hear a little bit from Juan, whether you have any thoughts on sort of what the panelists have just said about culture.
I guess the things mentioned about like people in education and their like ideological identification as a worker or not. I don't really think that's actually that unique to education. I think just in normal, even like fast food or warehouse, people know what's going on. People know that they're being exploited. But there's like, as I was having a conversation about what I was going to say earlier, people put these things out of their mind just to deal with work. They forget that they're mad about this thing. They forget that there's reasons that the manager did this and that's why I can't, buy this or something like that. Like people know these things. They just put it out of their mind. So I don't think like education workers in particular have something unique in them about like trying not to think about why they might have common cause with other people, because I think it's across the board thing that happens.
Why do you think that is? I mean, why do you think that someone who's working like a really, a job where there's at least a kind of tradition of like organizing, can put it out of their minds in our society today so quickly that this is a problem about them as workers? I mean,
Well, I think some of it's based on hopelessness. Like I can't change this, so why think about it? Why dwell on something that I can't change? I think that's probably the attitude on it.
that's where we should start.
I think you also had some other points, possibly, Paul.
I did. There's someone in the back that wants to say something. I'm sure I can make my points
Okay.
in the course of this.
Okay, in that case, I guess we can begin our Q&A. Just so you were aware, I'm going to make my sweeping motion from left to right. So I'll start with you. Sorry, what was your name?
Danny, I just wanted to follow up on something that Walter Ben Michaels was talking about, because you mentioned two things. You mentioned the sort of elitists in art, but not elitists in politics. And also it was mentioned both by Juan and Walter as well, this sort of, well, let's not glorify, say, the worker, per se, but that we can use art to sort of express a shared experience. And I guess to me, the first thing that kind of comes about is I've also seen how this sort of shared experiences, and I hope this doesn't sound bad, like almost turned into entertainment, like that there's been songs and poetry written about how this sort of shared experience of being down and out or just living in sort of abject poverty. And so then I guess my question is, how could one then use the sort of elitism in art? Because you mentioned art and modernity, and the first thing that then came to my mind is then the possible transformative character of art, at least as envisioned. And how could that be then used instead of just needing, sort of trying to, not glorify, but make some kind of art out of experience, and instead make it transformative instead of just as like something to live with?
Yeah, so the quick answer to that is I don't think that art in general is of much use in helping people organize themselves. What Juan said was about shared grievances, and I completely agree with that. I don't think an art about shared grievances would be a pretty lame art indeed. It'd be like, you can only take that much in The Office. I actually can only take about 1.5 episodes. So I don't think that there's a sense, I don't think that the shared grievance thing is a useful way of making art. So I would say the first thing is that politics are really helpful in understanding art. Art is not, in general, as helpful in understanding politics. So there's a certain sense in which I think it's true. I would make an argument. You don't have to buy the book. Go to nonsite.org, which publishes both me and Adolf and Jennifer Ashton there, and others of you, if you just raise your game a little bit, because we're elitist in publishing too. And you can read the argument, right? There's an argument there about what the relation is between certain ideas today, which the art students will be familiar with, about the relative autonomy or lack of autonomy of the work of art, and how that relates to a certain conception of what a single entity it is, how that relates to a certain conception of your relation to your audience, and how that relates to a certain conception of basically what a society is. I think in looking at certain kinds of major artworks today, you can actually begin to learn something about the way our society is structured. So it's a concept that I would say, for artists who don't have a class politics, but do have what I describe as a class aesthetic. But it's not like, by seeing those works, you're going to inspire people to go ahead and organize. So I think actually, art's the last thing we need to help people organize. I don't mean that it never happens. There's got to be someone who saw Guernica and said, fucking A. But you know, a lot of people have different kinds of experiences. So I don't think that we're thinking about art and politics the right way if we're thinking how can we use great art, bad art, or any other kind of art to produce a kind of political organization. But I do think it's totally essential that we produce a political organization. And that's why it's useful not to make the mistake of thinking that musicals will help us do it. That's for Gregor.
You're in the back, right? Yes.
So this question is for Walter Michaels. You said early on something about how we're educated with this idea that we can do anything. That's like a big part of education today. I feel like there's a way in which psychology in general, psychology in the working class has turned into this way where this idea of cultivating and projecting your own identity or something like that. Like there's this sort of narcissistic historical transformation into a kind of like narcissistic psychology all across the board or something like that. And when you're talking about organizing politically in relation to shared grievances, when you're talking about solidarity, I wonder if there's been, from the heyday of social workers movements from the 1890s to like the mid-20th century, whether there has been, thanks to the expansion of education, baby boomer parenting, etc., a transformation in human subjectivity which does not allow for that kind of organization, or which doesn't allow, but makes it much more difficult. Because I forget your name, but on the far right said something about how what makes workers not want to organize is their hopelessness, but maybe there's it's their hopefulness. The idea they're always preparing for their brilliant future or something like that.
So I don't really think there's been I don't have it's kind of a Christopher Lasch thing. I'm not saying there isn't something right about that, but so for years, I teach American literature, and I thought for years that the most destructive and mind-numbing thing that had ever been drilled into the heads of all the students I ever taught was the phrase "the American dream." Everything was sort of about it. They kind of really believed in it, and if the exam, and actually they always treated every exam as, no matter what it was about, as a literature, Americans were talking about the American dream, the failure of it, the success, or whatever. So the American dream sort of went away in the last 10 or 15 years because it's been replaced by a personalized dream, which is what you're talking about. But it's not worse. It's more sophisticated. In other words, I don't think it's the narcissism that goes on there, but it is the sense that it's a kind of Dancing with the Stars kind of thing, where the celebrities are the whole model of what was the show that's now off the air, the Fox show about singing. What was it? American Idol, yeah, the whole American Idol sort of structure of the thing, which is that you're telling the kid you can be whatever you want to be. So the first thing is, in the best of all possible worlds, that's totally false. But in our world, it is really, really deeply false. But it's not, I think, that the problem is with the psychology of the kids. I think hopelessness is much better. I don't think that you want to blame the baby boomer parents for this. For one thing, the baby boomer parents, that's a real stratified class phenomenon. I teach at UIC. Adolf teaches at Penn. When Adolf describes his students, they are the pure products of baby boomer parents. When I think about my students, some of them are, but you can see the class fractions within them. Some of them, no, they aren't that at all. But they're just as fucked in a certain way, because they basically have a different level, a different kind of hopelessness, but they have the same sort of structural problem. So I don't think it's psychological. I think what it really is the whole fundamental notion of equality, which is geared toward meritocracy and equality of opportunity, is basically reduced to you can be anything you want. And the minute some kid starts to believe that, they are lost forever. So our goal is to teach them that they cannot. And solidarity is a nice way of putting it, but it's not just solidarity. It's also, actually look at this world. Look at what it would take to transform this world. Not only can you not make a difference on your own, you cannot even conceive of what a difference would look like on your own. That, to me, is what should be the core of the American educational system. And you'd think it'd be easy to teach it because so many kids are learning it from their everyday lives. It turns out not.
If the other panelists have something to say to those questions, feel free to type up. You had a question.
Yeah, I wanted to, sorry, what's your name again?
Mike?
Paul.
Yes, Paul. I wanted to sort of touch on what you said. I want to make a few distinctions that I think are kind of important between some of the art that you showed. So first with the novel that you said was written by one of our security guards here.
Oh, yeah.
I found that really interesting because it's sort of like, it's an expression of recognizing the limited potential of class politics, sort of, because like this person is sort of engaging in a very working class job, but at the same time realizes that like sort of has chosen to like put their art on a platform that isn't expensive for it to like to put it out there. And
I think it's like 99 cents online.
exactly, yeah. And in a way it's sort of like the security guard hasn't like decided to like sort of work toward like engage in art in a way that like she's working towards this as sort of like a profession, and it sort of chooses to isolate this from their own engagement in the working class. Whereas like the art of Wafa Bilal, aside from being like, you know, very political, is also extremely like, it makes statements about itself, not just in terms of like the content, but in the fact that it's very expensive. And he mentioned that a lot in his lecture. He said that he's sort of like a very important part of his art is that it is expensive and that he's spending a lot of money and he's deciding how to spend it. Like for example, he said his next project is, like I'm quoting him, he said he wanted to make a statue of Saddam Hussein, like a massive statue, and send it into orbit around the Earth, which is going to be extremely expensive. But aside from that...
Well worth the money, right?
Totally, yeah. But aside from that, I sort of agree with you and don't think that art necessarily, even activist art, really has a place in politics or should have a place in politics. Because like it's essentially like validating your art is like the idea of the art is a use value thing, and therefore makes the art a use value thing, and doesn't necessarily like try to sort of turn ideology into something that can be exchanged. And it's sort of like, and it does sort of like aim to like sort of does stay in this elitist space often, and like in itself like referencing like theory and movements and art history does remain sort of esoteric in and of itself. Yeah, this is more a comment you can respond to than a question.
I don't have a direct response to that, but I would like to get back to this question about that Walter was raising about how you want to think about the quality of a work of art, and it seems to me that you know, it's pretty obvious that you know, people who are doing DIY type projects and are you know, neighborhood based and are you know, working with a group of friends and they think of what they're doing as just fun to do, interesting to do, and doing it as part of the relationships they have with the other people. I don't have a problem calling that art, and at the same time, you know, if it's a painting or if it's a mural or something like that, and at the same time, you know, I don't think that anyone would be confused about the difference between that and you know, the stuff that you see in the museums and the galleries. I just think that it's going to be part of any left culture that is a mass culture, that there's going to be an awful lot of that going on. I noticed, you know, like in the description of the panel, Prolekult was mentioned, and I don't know an awful lot about it, but one of the things that I did learn about it, I read this stuff so long ago, and it was important to, in the 70s, to look back at that history, yeah. And one of the things that strikes me about it is that, you know, on the one hand you had people at the top like Mayakovsky and Lunacharsky, and they had these theories about what proletarian art should be, but you know, but at the base you had at its peak 500,000 people. 500,000 people, and they were doing all sorts of things that they suddenly felt, well, not suddenly because it started after 1905, but they felt enabled to do by the social ferment, by the mass movements, by the revolution. And they were doing especially theater and choirs. Not so much writing, but especially theater and choirs, but there were a lot of writing groups. And I don't, you know, that didn't go on for very long, but it's, you know, of course there were, you know, adult literacy campaigns too that were very important. But it seems to me that, you know, like if you want to praise something about that movement, I'm more ready to get excited about what all of those people were doing, you know, like whether it was good theater or bad theater. I don't care, because that's not so much the point as the fact that they were doing it. You know, it's like, how many of you are parents and have gone to your kids' school plays? you don't want to go to some other kid's school play, but it's part of.
Well, so that's a really good way of putting the point, right? Because no one's against, for sure, I'm not against the idea that there should be lots of participation in things people enjoy. But like Kant actually made the point a long time ago, which is that kind of the essence of a certain relation to art is that it's supposed to transcend the interest one has in it as an individual, right? In other words, it's not like you do want to go to your school kids' play because you love your children. A little bit less when that play is over, but you love your children. But you don't want to go to like your friend's school kids' play for the same reason, yeah? So the thing about it is that those things don't belong to the history of art. I'm not trying to be elitist and they're bad things. I'm just saying I'm elitist with respect to a certain notion there, that they don't belong to the history of art. And then the other thing you want to say is that the question of what their politics is up for grabs. That is, that's a different story. The story. So, for example, I don't think any of us thinks there's first of all, we all think there's way more art going on outside the theaters, the professional theaters of the U.S. today than there was going on in the Soviet Union back in the 20s, the height of Prolekult. Way more art today. None of it, or I'm going to say none of us, hopefully none of us thinks that has any, I won't say it isn't political, but it isn't left political, right? It doesn't have any useful for the left political content. The whole debate about whether art is political or not is already in a certain sense misplaced, because the correct question should be not whether it's political or not, but insofar as it's political, is it a good politics? And the question of a good politics is, as we've seen just in the last day and a half, not an uncontroversial question. So you want to be thinking through what that means. But I totally agree with you. It's not. The point is not that the security guard, it's personally admirable the security guard wrote that novel. It's also possible the novel is an important novel. In that case would be a really interesting fact about it. It could have been written by a security guard at the School of the Art Institute. But the fact that it's written by a security guard at the Art Institute does not make it an important novel.
I would say, I want to come back to what you were saying about all the theater and what the political character of it is. We're in a time when there aren't the huge mass movements. Those people who are doing theater now, if mass movements develop, they'll do different theater, some of them. Yeah. And that's what happened in the 30s.
Occupy Oklahoma. Truly horrifying thought.
This question is for Paul, but other people, of course, are welcome to comment. It's about 2 slides that were in your slideshow. One of them said it was a poster, and it either said white hipsters out of Pilsen.
Yeah, that was the. Yeah.
Did it say white hipsters or hipsters?
No, it just said hipsters, but
Okay,
I think
way.
the implication was.
So
I think you read it.
Yeah. So that was presented in the context of your whole slideshow was kind of like with at least a positive vibe around it. Like this is something oh, that's good.
No, I didn't mean that. I actually had to.
Let me finish.
Yeah.
So it was in the slideshow, and it seems somewhat celebratory, and but to me it reads as right wing because it isn't recognizing displacement of people from their houses as part of a market phenomenon, and it more kind of jumps on this idea of gentrification is just this racial problem, and that's the way it's popularly understood, I think, especially on the left. And then also the slide about the Republican National Convention in 2004 and the art around that, and in the 2004 Republican National Convention, there was there were a lot of protests around it, but ultimately it just means that people vote for the other capitalist party, the Democratic Party. So I'm just wondering how these pieces of art or political communication are actually something that should be. I felt like your slideshow was saying that these are things that we should look upon as somewhat positive examples. That's at least what. But I did leave the room for a second, so then I was wondering if at the beginning you might have said something these are right-wing examples, but I didn't think you actually said that. I just want to put that caveat out there.
Okay, am I interrupting now?
No, I'm done.
Yeah, well, I had actually planned to discuss the gentrification and the role of the artists in it a little bit more, and that was just, to me, it was just a funny poster. But I think that it does raise questions about, obviously, art students, other students are moving into these neighborhoods because they can't afford not to, if the rents are that low. But there are also artists who are moving in there, setting up studios, and they're in neighborhoods where there aren't that many opportunities for the people who live there, the people in that community, to enjoy art, to learn how to make art, to have the resources that you need to do some of this art. Even if it's just printmaking equipment or a pottery wheel. And it seems to me that if artists are moving into those neighborhoods, then it's a question whether they have some responsibility to be part of that community and not just be there for the low rent, because they are having an impact on the community. It's not their fault that the community is gentrifying. It's the way in which it's very profitable for some people for the market to work. And it has a lot to do with the way in which we just had an election, and one of the issues that wasn't quite spoken about in this way was there's very unplanned, or rather development that's concentrated in some neighborhoods rather than spread out through the whole city. That's the real subtext of Garcia's campaign. And it seems to me that people should be aware of the consequences of what they're doing, whether they're responsible for the position that they're put in or not. And I'd like to think that there are going to be more and more artists like Eric Garcia. They move into that neighborhood, and Eric's from Albuquerque. He didn't grow up in Pilsen. And who are going to try to figure out ways to be part of the community and give something to it.
So can I say just to that too, because I want to give you a positive example. There's a guy called Daniel Shea. So some of you might know Daniel. He was in Chicago for a while. He wasn't at the Art Institute, but I know he has connections. He's a photographer. He's published a couple of books. The most recent book is a book called Blizner Ill, as in Blizner, Illinois. And it actually, it's not about where he lives. It has nothing to do with where he lives. But it actually is a work of art. It's a collection of photographs, a structured collection of photographs that deals with, he's an artist who understands himself for change correctly as political, and actually has a kind of not fully understood good politics. And there's a way in which, to me, if you begin to think about what the aesthetic responsibility of the artist is in relation to gentrification, it has nothing to do with how the artist acts when he or she lives. That is a kind of ethical responsibility, political responsibility that you would have as a kind of person. But you could never leave your damn room and wish that all the people on the street demonstrating for something would just shut the fuck up so you could get your work done, and nonetheless be producing art that had a stronger relation to a kind of analysis of what our current problems are than the guys who are out there in the streets. I'm not saying that Dan Shea doesn't. He actually does have a kind of community relation. But I completely recommend that book if you want an example of what I think is powerful political art now. Not powerful because it will seduce anyone to the left, but powerful because it's organized and structured and imagined in a way that actually embodies a left politics.
Did any of the other panelists need or wanted to speak to that? No? So I guess we move back. And Doniel, I'll come back to you. Sorry, make sure to raise higher because I'm kind of short, but I'll have you speak first and then we'll move on to you.
Okay. So I wanted to ask a question about working class culture as potentially a barrier to politics. So especially in some of the groups that I run in, there's a rhetoric of loving your job and being creative. I think it's tied to this, you can do whatever you want to. But it's also about self-expression. I think art school is very fertile ground for this type of idea.
That's why it's so hard to get good politics at art school.
So I'm wondering.
They proved the rule.
I'm wondering if you see this as a problem. What can be done to combat a vibrant but potentially repressive working class culture, and I guess I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that. I mean, the creativity thing is a huge thing, also for the reformers in my union. It's one of the most repeated things, and actually there was a piece in Labor Notes a day or two ago about how, we had won this great contract by creativity, and that amounted to, a participatory... I was thinking about the other thing, besides the idea that, members might be inspired by, a culture or something, or aesthetics, there's also the idea of like the member as the artist, like the activist as the artist, him or herself. And so we actually had like a participatory protest opera. There was a hashtag. So that was what like creativity. I know there were some disparaging things said about hashtags earlier. So, but that was what creativity was supposed to amount to, and the fact that we had allied with, again, our most important allies, the undergraduates. So anyway, this has been a consistent thing for this reform movement. It's a big thing to say there were all these members who had all these creative ideas, and the UAW shut them down, and that's the narrative. So yeah, I mean that's a real issue, because then you're never talking about whether these strategies and these great ideas are actually likely to put any pressure on your management or not. And in the case of most of them, there wasn't any really serious argument that they were, and the evidence strongly suggests that they did not. But yeah, it's very pervasive. You know, it's an attitude that people have that is also very common, I think, in sort of student activist groups, just generally, that the point is just for people to be involved, and then the point of the activism is just for people to express their individual creativity. So that's a real problem.
And, sorry, I can't see you very well.
That's okay. So I was thinking about this idea of grievance and cultural production, and one of the main areas of grievance in the public spheres that I operate in is grievance about cultural production, particularly along the binaries of race, and people spending a lot of time in discourse about different representations of themselves on television or music, and then having discourse about, depending on how that unfolds, that is a main explanatory for continuing inequalities. And it seems like that has become a more central part of the political discourse, which, in my opinion, is distracting from other forms of discourse and organizing that we need to do. So one question, particularly for Professor Michaels, is do you think this kind of critique, or how legitimate is that critique? I mean, is there something legitimate about trying to police these forms of representation? And two, how can we intervene to make sure that those conversations don't dominate other forms of political discussion that we need to have?
Yeah, so that's a hard question. For the first part, it's easy to say, no, there's nothing legitimate in my view about that critique. Virtually nothing hinges on the correct representation of various groups. And indeed, you can see this very clearly in France over the last 10 years, because you begin to get a kind of race-based social movement in France, and the first thing people are outraged about is there are not enough black guys like on French TV. And then you get a few more black guys on French TV, and it's still not. So the purest version now is, have you seen the debate over the new emojis?
Yeah, I heard.
So the race-based emojis have emerged. So, but amazingly enough, to mixed reviews, because I think it's a pure form of American racialization. Because the complaint was, all the fucking emojis look like white guys. I mean, you have to really have a broad notion of white guys. Also, a broad notion of look like. That word. And now you can produce like racially or at least tinted emojis. Then the question becomes right away: do you have a responsibility to use them? You have to identify every time you write this. I saw somebody the other day, someone saying, it's an example of Apple's racism that they're now requiring people to do. It is a no-win situation in a certain way, but it's also a no-lose situation. Sort of like what Adolf was saying in the earlier panel about, in the more serious version, but still problematic in the whole question of being killed by the police when black, stopped for driving while black. Because the whole question is always going to be, in neoliberal discourse, was it racist or would they have stopped you anyway? You would say, that's not the real problem. The real problem is the whole form of neoliberal policing. So if you go back to your version of this, it is as long as the fight is about what proportion of people of color on TV is required to represent people, we're buying into a whole model. And the first thing we're buying into is the model of role models. And the whole point of the model of role models is that you can be him. But the whole point of my little mantra is, no, you fucking can't. There's almost no chance that you can be him. You could be him like you could be Michael Jordan or Hillary Clinton, or you can't be. So the point's got to be, in a certain sense, that racial representation in the media is a kind of just little surface phenomenon of a much larger problem. The role model, which is deep in the history of civil rights, going back to overturning Brown v. Board, is deep in the model of it, and that's what organization like the kind you guys are doing, in the campaign with the CTU has got to overcome. But how to do it, you probably know more about than I do. Maybe he does.
I have one small suggestion.
since I know what one of the images that comes to mind, a massive box of fried pork chops sent to Dr. Precious to just hope for the best.
All right, the discourse is here to do low. Are you all looking forward to the closing plenary? We'll really get rolling.
Did I miss anybody in this area?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to turn the conversation back to history and as opposed to the present. And I wanted to recall the example of the Social Democratic Party in Germany at around the turn of the century, which was a mass, socialist party that did sort of foster a, socialist working class culture and identity, which is something that we don't have anymore. And that, for example, the party, published socialist-themed children's books, socialist choral groups, gymnastics groups, group camping trips for the families in the party. And I wanted to ask if that is something that you wish we could return to, or if you thought that that was problematic in its time. That was that cultural, in the broad sense, component of the party back then, something that a leftist party should try to build and foster again.
I'm going to let Juan have a chance to speak because he's all the way there jammed in the corner.
As far as like the cultural stuff around like a political or like a union or a party, I think that it's a good thing. I mean, I grew up with a positive view of unions because of the union, my dad's union, rented the swimming pool in town, and all the letter carriers at the post office, took their kids there. And I identified the union with kids that I was friends with and people that my dad was friends with. And they don't really do those types of like cultural things anymore. But I think that kind of stuff is actually important, as long as it doesn't, don't get carried away with it. I think there's some examples of like European immigrants and their communities they had, especially in Minnesota, like the Finns, the Finnish people up there. They sometimes eventually got carried away with the cultural stuff, and then the political stuff was completely subordinate to the cultural stuff. So I think that there should be like a balance. Some of the cultural things are pretty important, and it's going to be filled in with something else anyway. Like it's going to be filled in with church. It's going to be filled in, with something else. So why can't we also have our own like alternative, culture?
I think that it's not so much a matter of whether things like that have to be created by some organization making the decision to do it. I think that a lot of those things just come out of people having a need and wanting to find some ways, setting up some ways to meet the need. Like there was all of these alternative cultural institutions in the late 60s and in the 70s, for example. And, for example, we were in a food co-op, right? I mean, it wasn't because we had some ideological thing about not wanting to go to the supermarket, but we found that we could get the vegetables really cheap by driving down to Haymarket, where a lot of the grocers went to get their vegetables, and buying in quantity and then sharing it on people, and it turned out to be a good social thing as well. And as for the camps, actually my son went to one of those camps that was probably set up in the 30s and still exists, and it's seen better days. Now it's more of a hippie thing. But they'll have some revolutionaries come and do programs for them still. But those are what?
Where did they get this evolution?
Good question. I'm sorry, what?
Like I know, like some of those.
Circle Pines is the name.
Oh,
yeah. Yes.
You know that one too?
Yeah.
I went to one of those camps in Germany and it was awful.
Everybody who went to this camp thought it was great, even when they had a vegan cook that was leaving them all hungry.
I think that happened when
I got fired.
I'm sorry, we have a couple more questions along with the donors, so go ahead.
I guess this kind of relates to what Jacob was saying, because if you look at that past culture, there's I think one of the things that characterizes neoliberalism for me in terms of its impact on people as a whole is the breakdown of these old traditional forms of social solidarity that often took the form of these working class cultural associations, whether unions that could provide a bit of a life outside work for their members, or church organizations, or these other traditional institutions, the family to some extent.
You know, what filled that void, I guess, was more popular culture, or I guess what you used to call mass culture. So the thing I kind of wanted to ask related to that is, like, the topic of this panel kind of relates to the idea of workerism, or like a sort of imbuing working class life with some sort of morality and assuming that there's some inherent good in working class culture. This was an idea that, like, the Prolekult embraced, and it existed in the 1960s and 70s as well in certain groups that, you know, like last night people were talking about students cutting their hair and stopping smoking pot, and Chris remarked that, you know, at the same time the workers were growing their hair and starting smoking pot. But, sorry, to get kind of back on track, I think, so, you know, I have a personal theory that almost all bad ideas start on the left and might, they might lose their left-wing content, but continue to exist. So today we have this affirmation of popular culture and obsession with popular culture, especially in the intelligentsia, that, you know, I guess some people have called it like poptimism or popism or whatever. And it goes just beyond music and visual art or television. But even, like, I worked in the restaurant industry for 8 or 9 years, and in food, like, they call it, like, snack wave. You know, rich people will come into the restaurant and want, like, a pork bun, you know, like street food. But anyhow, sorry. So I guess the point is that, like, there used to be an argument from this position of elitism against this sort of affirmation of mass culture, and that seems to have gone away to some extent. And instead, there's a real fascination with kind of exploring maybe the latent, hidden potential in this Rihanna song.
Deeply hidden. Deeply hidden.
Yeah, it's really deeply hidden.
Most of us are yourself.
So it's kind of like, the thing I was thinking about is in 1984, like for the proles, they print these books with machines, right? They're romance novels that, you know, are computer written. And like, if you wanted to update that, there would be like people analyzing the intrinsic worth of these computer written books in the lower ranks of the party. Sorry, I'm kind of going way off. I'll just leave that there. But I think, like, the point is that maybe, like, some sort of this workerism still exists in this kind of somewhat uncritical embrace of popular culture.
I completely agree with that. It's wrong.
Oh.
I mean, I think you're right. It does exist. Half of, like, academic culture, literary culture, is that. And every part of that is bullshit. So, yeah. But that's also why I think it's important to sort of think about the elite art question.
No other comments over here?
Yeah, you've spoken about the external praise of those who toil during times of advanced capitalist production, and now I was wondering if you could comment on the phenomenon of more sartorial culture appropriation, which among millennials is more naively exoticized, and among Generation X was ironic quiche of this often very racialized religious iconography, and which has been this has been identified with the working class since Marx. It's the heart of the heartless world, and so I was wondering about the class dynamics of cultural appropriation in regards to religious culture.
Nice topic.
Anybody want to tackle that?
I mean, I wondered about, there are a lot of like social justice blogs, I guess, or whatever, that suggest that cultural, like an absolute prohibition on cultural appropriation, just period, which I guess has never made any sense to me, not even as like a good idea or a bad idea, but just as like completely impossible. Like there is no culture without cultural appropriation. So the question is, like, you know, some forms of cultural appropriation might be racist or sexist or whatever, and I don't know, but yeah, whatever, might be like problematic in some way, but just the mere fact that you've established that something is a form of cultural appropriation to me doesn't, you know, I think that's just kind of obvious. So yeah, I've never, like maybe someone can point me in the direction of a better discourse on cultural appropriation than that.
Yeah, I wonder, I mean, like, to follow up on that, isn't cultural appropriation a notion that has its roots in the market and capitalist property relations, right, ultimately? Right, and the whole idea. And pardon me, of course, in the Victorian race theory, Like, how could I forget that? Right? Because it hinges on the notion that culture is, well, it's a phenomenon that lives in me. As a wise man once said, I'm not Jewish because I do Jewish things. I do Jewish things because I'm Jewish, right? So there's that, and the only way that you can appropriate somebody's culture is that it belongs to them in an essentialized way, and belongs as property. So you basically jack their property, and it's their essentialist property.
Right.
So yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, I don't know what would you add.
Yeah, we're not really getting into the religious part of your question, which I confess I didn't understand fully, so we can maybe come back to that afterwards. But I think that's right. I think worrying about what the cultural appropriation industry, i.e. the industry of opposing cultural appropriation, is, again, one of those many empty forms of kind of apparently left kind of politics. Like worrying for a second about whether Taylor Swift, is that her name? Whoever she is. Yeah. I actually know Jocelyn. I read Jezebel. I can do a kind of authenticity, although it's kind of weird, fucked up kind of. Worrying about whether she's appropriating, sort of like blackness in like failing to twerk or whatever it was she didn't do, is it's a mug's game. It just doesn't matter whether she was or not for any imaginable politics. So the problem is not which side are you on. The problem is the minute you get into the debate, you've completely lost a sense of it. I think, there's a larger account of what's wrong with the idea of cultural appropriation, everything I've written in the last 15 years. So I think that's right. But it doesn't get to the religious part.
Yeah, can I clarify just the religious part? It's that certain objects which are culturally appropriated by perpetrators of such acts, they often have very sensitive ceremonial concerns for...
You mean like for Native Americans?
Yes, like the headdresses or Indies and that sort of...
How about the rosary bead fashion?
I just think everybody should have the right to offend people. I mean, I don't know which side of this you're on, but I am not going to worry about the right to offend Native Americans any more than I'm worried about the right to offend Jews by being culturally insensitive about mezuzahs or whatever. Whatever that might be. Yeah, I just don't think that is, it may be a political issue, but I think it's not a left political issue.
One thing I would add to that is, specifically with religious cultural appropriation, one of the big things that I see, on these same clubs is like yoga and these white people doing yoga, right?
So the new yoga journal at Berkeley, there's a new journal about yoga at Berkeley, and the first issue, it is Berkeley, and I didn't teach there for like 13 years. The first issue is about what? You get points.
Decolonizing yoga.
That's really close. It was just yoga and race. Right? And then the prompt was a million different ways in which yoga, as it's being practiced now, is racist in the U.S. So you want to say that's not on the list of the social problems we confront, the whiteness of yoga.
So I think that's right. The one thing I was going to add was that this concern among leftists about the cultural appropriation of yoga has an identical twin among these terrifying Hindutva activists in India who have this, very scary right-wing nationalism, which leads them to kill Muslims or whatever, right? And one of their big charges in opposing themselves to European hegemony or whatever is they do stuff like they take our yoga, which is kind of ironic because this thing called the pizza effect, where the prominence of some ethnic cultural bit of culture is a result of it being taken up in the West. So that happened with pizza apparently, and I believe that yoga is also one of these, that its prominence in Indian culture is a result of how it got taken up in the West. But now it's this sacrosanct thing.
Well, so the good news in the U.S. is we're not yet killing cute white girls in yoga pants.
I'm going to take the last round of questions so we can wrap up. I know that Indoni in the back. Can I see the number of hands clearly? All right, we'll try to get through this as quickly as possible. Indoni, please go.
Question for Juan. We talked at lunch of my botched recruitment to the IWW, and I remember when I got in, and there was no connection, and as we were talking over lunch, the IWW had a much more concerted effort to train people and put them to work and all this. And when I was interested in the IWW in the 90s, it was cultural. Like the kind of the things that sort of drove me to Annie DeFranco and all the sort of 90s. Yeah, and Tom Phillips being in this.
It's okay, this is a safe story.
So this seems to be like the problem the IWW has to deal with now. Like you must have had to the kind of aestheticization of the politics and just thinking about Jacob and the way that you seem to be dealing with the same kind of issues. Like really, what we need to do is organize people and put them. Reestablish the kind of connections that you had when you were young among your workers. There seemed to be a way in the 90s that this aesthetic punk dimension that I was not politicized through any kind of struggle or any kind of, it was through punk music and, in the 90s cultural. Does this come up in discussions in the IWW and working through and trying to, or is this, is it even a problem? So you put into a full question, but.
I think anywhere on the left, there's always going to be a problem between balancing the subcultural elements that it was incubated in over the years and trying to do actual work. I think, probably in the 90s, it was more culture. There wasn't much going on. But there's still cultural stuff. We have a children's camp in the summer. We need to have socials every once in a while. But I think it's changed because people don't see it as that's it. That actually the expectation is that you do attend workplace organizing or encourage it or get people on board, start a committee at your workplace. So the cultural aspect of it, I think, has been de-emphasized or changed in a way that is more pointed towards organizing.
Great. Ed?
I think some of our conversation following Jacob's question about the pre-war German SPD sort of highlighted the way in which a lot of their activities with workers vis-a-vis culture could be seen in a sense as having been the kind of midwife of German proletarianization. In other words, in the absence of a successful revolution, these were simply ways in which the SPD helped to proletarianize the German working class. But maybe related to that, one other thing that wasn't mentioned that the German SPD did was that it undertook to teach the working class, to kind of make it inherit the legacy of bourgeois culture. So a worker might first listen to Beethoven or perhaps read Hegel through the SPD. And what strikes me is that would be completely anathema to the vast majority of the new left, right? That idea that there was something, it's almost in parallel, actually, to the political conception of Marxism during pre-war social democracy, which was that movement inherited the now stalled and impossible continuation of the bourgeois revolution. And that kind of had, I believe they understood that kind of had some parallel in culture. And so I wonder, I guess now, whether you see that as necessary, whether a reconstituted Marxian left would actually undertake education of that kind, or whether bourgeois culture and its inheritance would be viewed as the new left viewed as just more conservative, reactionary obfuscation.
So I want to say one thing about that, which is that I'd be remiss in my duty as a professor of literature if I didn't say to every person in this room, when you leave this room, you should go on Amazon and buy a copy of the first volume. It's the only one that exists in English. If you read German, then you can read all three. Peter Weiss's, in English, The Aesthetics of Resistance. And you should read and reread the first about 20 pages before you go further. It's a remarkable work of art, but those first 20 pages this is a book written in the 70s. And it's written in the 70s, but set in the 30s. And the first 25 pages are three young men, kids, all of whom are communists. One of whom is Jewish also, in Nazi Germany in 36, 37. And they are standing in front of the Pergamon altar, which has been brought, a century before, a high mark, of bourgeois culture, in a certain sense, the appropriation of it. And they are asking themselves the question, what can this work of art say to us? And the question is, what can not only a high work of art, but a work of art that's imagined in Germany at that time, not implausibly, as the kind of origin of a certain sense of what great art is. And the demand is that for these kids, who are not yet proletarian intellectuals, they're just workers, But their understanding of what it means to be workers and to be revolutionary workers is that their part of their task is to see what they can make out of great art for themselves. So yeah, the minute we stop thinking of art as the expression of somebody's culture or as a form of self-expression, to use a term we used before, and start thinking of it as something very, very different, embodied in their encounter with the Pergamon altar, is the beginning of the moment in which we start to have an experience of art that actually says something to our politics. And we can't necessarily have that through going to the Pergamon altar, but any single person in this room can have that by actually taking seriously and reading through what is a very, very, in a certain sense, difficult book, but a very, very powerful book, and that's the Aesthetics of Resistance, Volume 1, in English. So that was meant to be responsive.
So I think I'm going to give somebody else a chance first. Who had their hands up? No? Oh, right.
I wanted to bring up something that you said, Juan, which was the idea that not all work is noble, and you pointed to, and how work is, in fact, a lot of work is very damaging to other working people and unemployed people and everyone else. And you gave the example, I think, of like environmentally work that's, damages the environment, but also, like prison guards. And I wondered what the panel, what kind of strategic thoughts the panel has about actually bringing that up in discussions in the labor movement or on the left, if we have left. Does anyone know how to actually bring that up in the movements that we're in?
As far as the environmental thing, I don't think that anyone's really found that an answer to that. In Minnesota and Wisconsin, at least up north, there's always been sort of split between the unions and say more leftists that are against the mining and stuff like that. I don't think, and that's been hard to bridge. And even people that want to get involved, leftists that want to get involved in union organizing, that's still a hard thing to do. So I don't know if it's even been attempted. I think in small ways, I guess in the 80s or 90s, I'd heard of some people in the IWW that made links with people that worked in the timber industry and tried to incorporate an environmental outlook as far as what was going on there. I couldn't say to the success of that, but that's the only thing that I've heard of as far as the environmental concern.
Well, it should vary, doesn't it, between workers in different sectors and different regions. And I think that as far as environment goes, there's, I know a guy who was a retired UAW worker, who was union activist, president of his local for a while, and he's working with retirees on ideas for creating jobs through investments in green energy and other things that are environmental, that promote environmental sustainability, both in Detroit, in the neighborhoods, but also calling for bringing, these UAW retirees are calling for doing something with the old abandoned factories.
I think I'm not asking so much how to solve the problem of the environmental crisis, and I certainly know what to say in an individual campaign. We just had this problem in Illinois with AFSCME, the union, opposing us, trying to close the Supermax prison. I think it's more the idea that was a big problem for us of attacking fellow workers and, problematizing this idea that work is noble, which I think is a problematic thought, and indeed a problematic deed. So I meant more just that spirit, which just, saturates really both the left and the right in some way.
Especially the right.
Yeah.
So I would.
But it doesn't help that the left.
So I have no organizational response, but I think it's important, it would be useful to make a conceptual distinction. I mean, one is the question of work itself and noble. And the point would be there that, you want to say exploited work, which the only kind of work we've got is not in itself a noble. And there's the second question, not necessarily secondary, which is the different work you're doing serving some kind of other useful purpose, that is regardless of the fact that it is not in itself a noble. So that's more like what we're talking about here. For me, the first point, though, is going to be the hard question we get to, which is that there is nothing in open work. It's not. There's other things we do that are probably worse. Yeah, we have to start with that. I agree.
Okay, so I guess we're going to have our last question, and then we'll conclude.
I guess, yeah, I just wanted to make a comment, like, just sort of pose an example that has to do with worker morality that was brought up earlier, and also sort of like the idea that work is like noble. I noticed like from using social media, particularly Instagram, that there's an overwhelming amount of memes that encourage like hard work and sort of like having a grind, where people like post these memes that say like talk about like how they work really hard and blah blah blah, like get up and get a job and start working more hours, and like in a way sort of criticizing people around them who are sort of exploited in those same ways for not working hard enough and not letting themselves be exploited more, in a sense, rather than criticizing the conditions that cause them to have to work more and more. And if anybody had any like sort of parallels to make about that, and how that's sort of becoming a really contemporary expression through internet and social media.
I have a one sentence answer. The others can make you better answers. The one sentence answer, the antidote to that is during the World Cup, there was a wonderful picture. People were taking off jobs. It was a wonderful picture of a bunch of Irish workers. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go to this. And they were. This was when Germany was imposing, or the Union was imposing, most strict austerity on Ireland, which is destroying the place. And there were a bunch of Irish workers, and they were positioned in front of a TV, watching World Cup, with a big banner overhead that said, "Angela Merkel thinks we're working." You know, and I thought that was like the purest fuck you to the whole thing that you could do. So I would just put that one next to every meme you get, or every whatever, about the advantage of work. It's really useful to not work.
Just to address that a little bit, I mean, I think that ties into like, well, I've seen the same thing too, like from friends, and it's usually like my Latino or Black friends, and I think that's actually a response to like the dominant American culture, which says that these folks are lazy, they're not doing, you know, they suck welfare dry and all this stuff, and that's like, that is a personal response that I'm not like these other people, as far as what that is. I think it ties into like the American dream type stuff too.
Yeah, and then at the same time, it's also sort of validating this identity that's sort of formed around that, like, oh, like there are like people who use welfare aren't working hard enough, and like and rather than saying like the reason why these people are like using welfare is because they are like it's harder for them to get jobs because they're discriminated against and things of that nature. But like like they're sort of saying like, oh well, I do work hard, like I do like provide for myself, and it's. But at the same time, it does come with like this sort of rhetoric of criticism of others. Like, it starts saying like they'll like put comments and say like get up and like start working, or like do like this and that. And
I mean, I have sort of a distinction to suggest, I guess, which is that like I've met in my life a lot of people and a lot of different kinds of people, and we probably all have, who take pride in like the number of hours they work and like how hard they work and kind of what that shows about their virtue as a person. But I really have only met, and there are lots of other professions where this is true too, but I've been around a lot of academics for most of my life, and I've really primarily met academics who took pride in sort of like the idea that their work was like, you know, a vocation, or like was noble somehow. So I think that's like a little bit of a distinction. And then, you know, relatedly, like I feel like academics may be among the most difficult people to convince that if they actually stopped working, that would actually like somehow disrupt, you know, the operations of their employer, which is kind of funny because it's like, well, if you think that you're a worker, then why don't you think that if you stop, do you think that the institute, I mean, why do you think they're paying you, you know what I mean? So, anyway, that would be a distinction I would propose.
That's great. So, before we conclude for the evening, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this panel discussion, and if you haven't already, do sign up for our mailing list downstairs.